How does a princess born into a crumbling kingdom, surrounded by the rotting edifices of a failed state, rise from the absolute ashes of poverty, neglect, and political irrelevance to become not just a queen, but the most powerful woman in Europe and the architect of the modern world? To truly understand the improbable and meteoric ascent of Isabella of Castile, we must first descend into the suffocating atmosphere of the mid-15th century Iberian Peninsula. The Kingdom of Castile, once the proud spearhead of the Reconquista and the land of El Cid, had devolved into a viper's nest of corruption, incompetence, and feudal anarchy under the impotent and disastrous rule of her half-brother, King Henry IV. Henry's court was not a place of governance. 'Twas a grotesque marketplace of treason, where powerful noble families such as the ambitious Pachecos, the Mendozas, and the Carrillos acted as petty warlords. They seized royal lands, levied illegal taxes on the peasantry, and openly mocked the crown, culminating in the humiliating Farsante de Avila, a spectacle where the rebel nobles burned an effigy of the king and kicked it into the dust, symbolizing the complete collapse of royal authority. In this volatile environment, Isabella was born not as a cherished heir, but as a political inconvenience. A spare to a spare, a girl whose very existence was a threat to the precarious balance of power maintained by the scheming nobility. Banished from the toxic intrigues of the capital to the isolated, windswept town of Arevalo, situated on the harsh Castilian plateau, she lived in conditions that were shocking for a royal. Chronicles of the time paint a grim picture of a princess living in near poverty, often lacking the basic necessities of her station, shivering in drafty castles with a scarcity of food and proper clothing, forcing her to rely on the charity of local convents and the kindness of servants. But the material deprivation was nothing compared to the psychological terror that defined her daily existence. Isabella lived alongside her mother, Isabella of Portugal, who was slowly, agonizingly succumbing to a violent and consuming madness. The young princess spent her formative years in the shadow of her mother's terrifying hallucinations, listening to the screams of paranoia and melancholy that echoed through the cold stone corridors, acting as nurse and guardian to the woman who should have protected her. She watched the person she loved most disintegrate, a daily reminder of the fragility of the human mind. All the while, she lived under the constant, suffocating threat of her brother's enemies, who viewed her as a pawn to be kidnapped, married off to a rival warlord, or even killed to destabilize the throne. This crucible of fear, isolation, and survival did not break her, it forged her. It stripped away any trace of entitlement or frivolity, instilling in her a rigid, almost military discipline and an intense, fundamentalist religious faith. She clung to Catholicism not merely as a set of rituals, but as the only source of order in a chaotic universe, a psychological anchor that would later define her iron-fisted rule. The girl who emerged from Arevalo was no longer a pampered princess. She was a survivor of the highest order, possessing a will of steel tempered by the fires of adversity, ready to wield power with a ruthlessness that would eventually bring the entire world to its knees. As Isabella matured from a neglected exile into a young woman of intense intellect and determination, she transformed from a liability into the most valuable diplomatic asset in King Henry IV's arsenal. The king, desperate to shore up his failing alliances and neutralize his sister's potential threat to his dubious lineage, attempted to force her into a series of politically expedient marriages that would have effectively exiled her from power. He negotiated to betroth her to the King of Portugal and later to the Duke of Berry, in France maneuvers designed to ship her off to a foreign land, strip her of her power base in Castile, and reduce her to a mere consort, a queen in name but a prisoner in reality. But Isabella, possessing a political acumen far beyond her years and a stubbornness that frustrated the male courtiers, understood clearly that a foreign marriage was a trap designed to decapitate her ambition. In a move of breathtaking defiance that stunned the courts of Europe, she rejected the king's commands, citing the ancient laws of Castile that required the assent of the nobles for a princess's marriage while secretly conducting her own clandestine negotiations. She set her sights on Ferdinand of Aragon, the heir to the neighboring kingdom, recognizing that a union with him would not only preserve her power, but create a superbloc capable of dominating the entire peninsula. The logistics of this alliance were straight out of a spy thriller, with Henry's troops patrolling the borders to intercept the groom. Ferdinand was forced to cross into Castile in disguise, dressed as a lowly mule driver and serving his own merchants to evade capture. He slept in stables, ate with servants, and dodged patrols in the bitter cold of the Castilian winter, risking his life with every step. The risks were astronomical. Had Ferdinand been caught, he likely would have been assassinated by Henry's agents to prevent the union. And Isabella would have been imprisoned in a convent for the rest of her life, her history erased. But the gamble paid off. In 1469, in the Palacio de los Viveto in Valladolid, they celebrated a secret wedding, utilizing a forged papal bull as they were cousins and needed dispensation that hadn't arrived yet to legitimize the union. This clandestine union, forged in rebellion and deceit, would ultimately stitch together the two great rival kingdoms of Spain. It was the first clear signal to the world that Isabella was not a pawn to be moved by men, but a master player who would rewrite the rules of the game herself. We are dedicated to building a digital archive of human resilience, but these deep dives require immense resources. If you value this level of research, please like and subscribe. This tells the algorithm that deep-form history still matters in a world of fleeting content. Help us keep these legends alive. The death of King Henry IV in 1474 did not lead to a peaceful transition of power. Rather, it was the starting gun for a brutal and bloody civil war that would test Isabella's claim to the absolute limit, wasting not a single moment to mourn. Isabella demonstrated a mastery of public relations and decisive action that left her enemies reeling. She instantly had herself proclaimed Queen of Castile in Segovia, seizing the royal treasury and the strategic Alcazar fortress before opposition could even mobilize. It was a coup d'etat in all but name, executed with surgical precision while Ferdinand was still absent in Aragon. However, her claim was immediately contested by her niece Joanna la Beltranea, whose paternity was rumored to belong to the court favorite, Beltran de la Cueva, rather than the late king, but who was nonetheless backed by the massive military might of her uncle, the King of Portugal. The ensuing War of the Castilian Succession was a savage conflict that tore the kingdom apart, pitting city against city and family against family. It was here that Isabella shattered the gender norms of the 15th century, refusing to remain sequestered in the safety of a palace spinning wool. While men fought for her crown, she rode among her troops, clad in partial armor, a visible and inspiring symbol of legitimacy that electrified the morale of her soldiers. She was not merely a figurehead, she was the quartermaster general of the army, tirelessly organizing supply lines, securing loans from the church to pay the mercenaries, and dictating strategy to her generals. She personally negotiated the surrender of the Alcazar of Segovia by riding into the fortress alone to face a rebel mob, a display of courage that became legendary. This relentless drive culminated in the decisive Battle of Toro in 1476, where the forces of Isabella and Ferdinand broke the Portuguese invasion in a chaotic clash of cavalry and infantry in the fog. While Ferdinand commanded the field, was Isabella's logistical genius and her ability to rally the cities that sustained the war effort. The victory was more than military, it was the divine validation of her reign, silencing the whispers of illegitimacy and proving to the fractious nobility that this woman was not a temporary placeholder, but a warrior queen who had won her crown through blood and iron. With the Civil War won and their enemies vanquished, Isabella and Ferdinand faced the monumental task of governing two distinct kingdoms without subsuming one into the other. A challenge they met with a revolutionary constitutional innovation. They established a power dynamic encapsulated in their famous motto, Tanto monta, monta tanto. She mounts as much as he, Isabella, as Ferdinand, signifying a profound equality where they ruled jointly yet independently. respecting the distinct laws, currencies, and Cortes parliaments of Castile and Aragon. This was not a merger, but a federation of two sovereigns, a delicate balancing act that required constant maintenance. An administrative genius to prevent friction between the Castilian and Aragonese courts. To enforce this new order, they became a peripatetic monarchy, traveling constantly across the rugged terrain of Spain. From Burgos to Seville, to bring the physical presence of the crown to every remote corner of the realm. They ensured that royal justice was not an abstract concept, but a tangible reality for their subjects. They systematically dismantled the feudal autonomy of the nobility, who had grown fat and lawless during the previous reign by restructuring the royal council to exclude the grandees and replacing them with Letrodos University-educated lawyers and bureaucrats loyal only to the crown. They also instituted the system of corregidors, royal officials sent to every town and city to oversee local councils and ensure the king and queen's will was followed. This was a direct assault on the feudal privileges of the aristocracy, forcing them to bend the knee to a central authority. This centralization of power was the prototype of the modern state, stripping the aristocracy of their political dominance and transforming them from rival warlords into decorative courtiers dependent on royal favor, all while the monarchs held the reins of administration with a grip that never faltered. The Castile that Isabella inherited was less a kingdom and more a lawless frontier. A land plagued by bandits, highwaymen, and robber barons who preyed upon the peasantry and merchants with absolute impunity. Travel between cities was a death sentence, and commerce had ground to a halt due to the exorbitant tolls demanded by local lords. Realizing that economic prosperity and political stability were impossible without public safety, Isabella resurrected and weaponized an old medieval institution, the Santa Hermandad, or Holy Brotherhood. Under her reforms, this was no longer a loose association of local militias, but Europe's first standing police force, organized, professional, and ruthless. The officers, known as mangas verdes, greensleeves, due to their uniforms, became a symbol of royal authority that struck fear into the hearts of criminals. What made this masterstroke of governance so brilliant was its funding. Isabella maneuvered the municipalities into paying for the Hermandad themselves, providing the crown with a formidable military force that cost the royal treasury nothing. We witnessed the Queen's terrifying commitment to justice as the Brotherhood swept through the countryside, dispensing summary judgment with a severity that shocked the nation. Bandits were hunted down and executed with arrows in public squares, their bodies left rotting as a grim message that the era of chaos was over. But the Hermandad was not just for common criminals, Isabella. Turned this force against the rebellious nobility, using the Hermandad to dismantle the fortified castles that had served as bases for feudal tyranny, physically tearing down the stone symbols of their defiance. This campaign of pacification proved once and for all that the crown was the ultimate authority in Castile, establishing a monopoly on violence that enforced the Queen's peace with an iron fist. Driven by a desire for absolute religious unity, which she viewed as the indispensable glue for political stability, Isabella made the controversial decision to petition the Pope to establish the Spanish Inquisition, a move that would forever stain her legacy with the smoke of the pyre. While often depicted solely as religious fanaticism, this decision was deeply rooted in Machiavellian statecraft. Unlike the medieval Inquisitions, which were under papal control, the Spanish Inquisition was a tool of the crown designed to root out dissent and consolidate royal power. This chapter introduces the dark and fanatical figure of Tomás de Torquemada, Isabella's confessor, whom she appointed as the Grand Inquisitor, unleashing a reign of terror that turned neighbors into informants and institutionalized paranoia. The primary targets were the conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, often rising to high positions in government, and finance, whom Isabella and Torquemada suspected of Judaizing or secretly practicing their ancestral faith. They believed these false converts were a cancer within the body politic, undermining the spiritual purity of the kingdom. The Inquisition became a bureaucratic machine of interrogation, torture, and execution, confiscating the wealth of the accused to fill the state's coffers, and eliminating a class of wealthy urbanites who were seen as a threat to the old order. We describe the horror of the auto da fe, act of faith, public spectacles of penance and execution that were designed to terrify the population into submission. It was a terrifying fusion of piety and politics, revealing that Isabella was willing to burn the flesh of her subjects to save their souls and, more importantly, to ensure that her kingdom was a monolithic block of Catholic orthodoxy where no deviation was tolerated. With her internal power consolidated, Isabella turned her gaze south to the Kingdom of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Western Europe and the final piece of the Reconquista puzzle. What followed was not a swift victory, but a grueling, grinding 10-year military campaign that functioned as much as a crusade as a war of conquest. Isabella's role in this war was critical. She was not merely a spectator, but the logistical mastermind behind the entire operation. Understanding that sieges are won by supply lines, she organized a massive commissariat, hiring thousands of mules and laborers to ensure that food, gunpowder, and heavy artillery reached the front lines through the treacherous mountain passes of Andalusia. In a pioneering move that predates modern military nursing, she established the first dedicated field hospitals in history. Known as the Queen's Hospital, consisting of large tents staffed by doctors and surgeons to care for the wounded, which drastically reduced mortality rates and endeared her to the common infantryman. Furthermore, she understood the psychology of war when the morale of the Christian troops flagged during the endless freezing sieges of Baza or Malaga. Isabella would personally visit the front lines often, bringing her children to remind the soldiers that they were fighting for the future of the faith and the crown. She was a master of psychological warfare as well, often appearing in full regalia to demoralize the defenders. Her presence was a force multiplier, turning the tide of the war through sheer persistence, and a refusal to accept anything less than total victory, even when the treasury was empty and her advisors suggested retreat. She pawned her own crown jewels, figuratively and literally leveraging her credit to keep the army in the field, demonstrating a singular, obsessive will that would not stop until the cross was raised over the Alhambra. The culmination of centuries of struggle arrived on the pivotal date of January 2, 1492, a moment that marked the geopolitical turning point of the Middle Ages. The chapter captures the visual splendor and immense emotional weight of the surrender as the last emir of Granada, Boabdil, rode out from the Alhambra to hand the keys of the city to Isabella and Ferdinand. It was the sound of 800 years of Islamic history in Iberia coming to a silence, in a symbolic gesture of profound respect and domination. The Catholic monarchs entered the Alhambra palace wearing Moorish clothes, appropriating the visual language of the conquered to elevate their own status as the new masters of this sophisticated civilization. They placed the silver cross of the crusade atop the highest tower of the Alhambra, signaling to the world that the Reconquista was complete. This victory sent shockwaves through Christendom. Bells rang in London and Rome, and Isabella and Ferdinand were granted the title of Catholic monarchs by the Pope. This elevated Isabella's status to that of the heavyweight champion of the faith. The completion of the Reconquista was not just a territorial expansion. It was the fulfillment of a messianic destiny that Isabella believed had been ordained by God, unifying the entire Iberian Peninsula save for Portugal under the cross and changing the map of Europe forever. It freed up the energy, the military veterans, and the religious fervor that would soon be directed outward, across the Atlantic, launching Spain into its golden age. However, in the wake of the glorious victory at Granada, the religious fervor that had fueled the war reached a fever pitch, curdling into a tragedy of biblical proportions. Convinced by Torquemada that the presence of Judaism in Spain was a contagion that threatened the spiritual health of her new converts, Isabella signed the Alhambra decree in March 1492, ordering the expulsion of all Jews from Spain who refused to convert to Christianity. we analyze this catastrophic decision, which forced hundreds of thousands of people, whose families had lived in Spain for centuries and contributed deeply to its culture and economy, to make an impossible choice between their faith and their home. Legend says that prominent Jews offered a massive sum of gold to the monarchs to revoke the edict, only for Torquemada to burst into the room, throwing a crucifix onto the table and shouting, "Judas sold Christ for 30 pieces of silver, will you sell him for more?" The decree unleashed a wave of human suffering that contradicts the glorious image of the United Kingdom. Families were torn apart, assets were sold for pennies, and a mass exodus began that scattered the Sephardic community across the Mediterranean to North Africa, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire. Beyond the moral atrocity, it was an act of economic suicide. The expulsion resulted in a massive brain drain, stripping Spain of its most skilled doctors, bankers, artisans, and intellectuals. This chapter reveals the complex and contradictory legacy of Isabella, a queen capable of immense vision and leadership, yet simultaneously responsible for an act of ethnic cleansing that would haunt Spain's economy and reputation for centuries, proving that her quest for a pure kingdom came at a devastating human cost. While the court was still intoxicated by the victory in Granada and the expulsion decree, a persistent, somewhat obsessive, and socially awkward Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus made one final, desperate petition to Queen Isabella. He proposed a radical plan to reach the markets of the East by sailing west, a concept that had been rejected by every other monarch in Europe, including the King of Portugal and the King of England. This chapter explores the skepticism of the Royal Council, the Letrados, who had correctly identified that Columbus had made a massive mathematical error regarding the circumference of the Earth. He believed the world was much smaller than it actually is. They were right, and he was wrong. Yet, where the experts saw bad math, Isabella saw divine potential. She was intrigued by this man who spoke with the same religious conviction that drove her. She looked for new horizons to expand her faith and her empire now that the Reconquista was complete. Columbus appealed to her missionary zeal, promising not just gold, but souls to be saved and funds to potentially retake Jerusalem. A dream that obsessed the pious queen. Isabella's decision to back him was not a triumph of science, but a triumph of intuition and ambition. She saw in Columbus a potential tool for divine destiny. A low-cost lottery ticket that, if it paid off, would outflank the Portuguese and give Castile access to the wealth of the Indies. Contrary to the romantic myth that has persisted for centuries, Queen Isabella, the first of Castile, did not actually strip the rings from her fingers and pledge her jewels to finance the voyage of Columbus. In reality, the financial architecture of the expedition was far more bureaucratic. The funds were scraped together primarily from the treasury of the Santa. Her mandad, the police force funds, and through loans secured by court officials like Udis de Santango, the royal treasurer who personally convinced the queen to take the risk. Santango argued that the cost of the voyage was less than the cost of entertaining a visiting dignitary for a week, and the potential rewards were infinite. This chapter details the signing of the capitulations of Santa Fe, a document that reads like a high-risk investment contract, granting Columbus immense titles such as Admiral of the Ocean Sea and a Viceroyalty, along with 10% of all riches found. These were exorbitant demands that a more secure monarch might have rejected. But Isabella's willingness to sign indicates the scope of her ambition and her readiness to gamble on the impossible. She was betting on a madman's calculations because of the potential return. The expansion of Catholicism and Spanish influence to the ends of the earth was worth the financial risk. It was a business deal struck between a mystic and a queen, a legal framework that would inadvertently hand over the governance of a new hemisphere to an adventurer with no administrative experience. When Columbus returned in 1493, not with spices and silks from China, but with gold parrots and captive indigenous people, it sent a shockwave through Europe that fundamentally shifted the geopolitical center of gravity, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Isabella immediately recognized the magnitude of the discovery and engaged in swift diplomatic maneuvering to secure her claim. She petitioned the Spanish-born Pope Alexander VI, leading to the Treaty of Tordesillas, which audaciously drew a line down the middle of the Atlantic, dividing the non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal. However, the discovery brought with it a profound moral crisis. This chapter focuses on Isabella's specific and often overlooked instructions regarding the treatment of the indigenous people. Unlike many of her contemporaries, she was deeply troubled by Columbus's enslavement of the natives. She declared them to be subjects of the Crown of Castile, and therefore free people who could not be enslaved, demanding they be treated with humanity and converted to Christianity. This created a sharp conflict with the brutal reality of colonization happening on the ground, where greed far outstripped royal decrees. It reveals a leader struggling to balance imperial ambition with religious morality, issuing laws that were noble in intent but tragically ineffectual in practice, as the distance across the ocean allowed the conquistadors to ignore her commands and commit atrocities in her name. At the very zenith of her political power, possessing a united Spain and a burgeoning global empire, Isabella's personal life began to unravel in a series of devastating tragedies, often referred to as the Curse of the Trastamaras. The narrative shifts from the glory of the throne room to the darkened chambers of a grieving mother. The first blow was the sudden death of her only son and heir, Prince Juan, in 1497, shortly after his marriage to Margaret of Austria. Juan died in Salamanca, likely of tuberculosis, a loss that shattered the dynastic alliances she had spent decades carefully constructing to isolate France. This was followed closely by the death of her eldest daughter, Isabel, Queen of Portugal, and her grandson, Miguel, who had been the hope for uniting the entire peninsula. But perhaps the most agonizing tragedy was the deteriorating mental health of her daughter Juana, who was next in line for the throne. Isabella watched in horror as Juana, later known as the Mad, displayed the same instability and erratic behavior that had consumed Isabella's own mother in Arevalo. This chapter paints a heart-wrenching portrait of the once mighty queen, now physically frail and emotionally broken, watching her dynasty crumble before her eyes. She was forced to grapple with the terrifying possibility that God was punishing her for her ambitions, or that the unity she had fought so hard to achieve would be undone by the madness of her successor and the opportunism of her husband and son-in-law. As her health failed rapidly in 1504, likely from uterine cancer or dropsy, Isabella summoned her remaining strength for one final act of statecraft, the dictation of her last will and testament. This was not merely a distribution of assets, it was a document of immense historical weight, a frantic attempt to rule from beyond the grave and secure the stability of Castile. The will reveals her deep anxiety about the succession. She recognized Juana's instability and inserted clauses that would allow Ferdinand to govern as regent if Juana proved incapable. Yet she also deeply distrusted Ferdinand's intentions, fearing he would strip Castile of its resources to benefit Aragon. We analyze the precise language of the will, in which she attempts to weave a legal safety net for her daughter while simultaneously laying out her final commands regarding the governance of the Indies. In a remarkable codicil added just days before her death, she reiterated her plea for the fair treatment of the indigenous people, commanding that they should not receive any injury to their persons or property. It is a portrait of a woman trying to bind the future with ink and parchment, fighting to protect her life's work even as she faced her own mortality, demonstrating that until her very last breath, her primary devotion was to the integrity of her crown and her conscience. Queen Isabella I of Castile died on November 26, 1504, in the royal palace of Medina del Campo, but the storm she unleashed continued to rage for centuries. The conclusion reflects on the totality of her impact, summarizing how her marriage united a fractured peninsula into the nation of Spain, how her funding of Columbus opened the Americas to European exploration and exploitation, and how her policies instituted the Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews. She is a figure of extreme contrasts, a devoted wife who usurped her husband's authority, a loving mother who forged a police state, a pious Christian who presided over mass suffering. The final thought posits her as perhaps the most powerful and controversial woman in history, whose legacy is not a simple black and white, but a complex tapestry woven from glory, faith, and blood. She ended the Middle Ages and birthed the modern era, leaving the audience to decide if the modern world she helped create, with all its wonders and all its horrors, was worth the terrible cost she paid to build it. Her life forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that history is often made by those with the will to do the unthinkable, leaving us to grapple with the shadows they cast long after they are gone.